All right, welcome back everyone to another deep dive. And today we're heading back in time, back to the 14th century, a time really of some pretty big shifts in philosophy. And we're going to be looking at a thinker who, well, maybe isn't a household name today, but was a big deal back then. Adam de Wodeham.
Yeah, Adam de Wodeham. I mean, this guy, he was really wrestling with some of the fundamental questions, right? Like, how do we know things? What is real? What about God? Big stuff. And, especially from the Franciscan school of thought at the time, his ideas, they really had an impact. Like, people were paying attention.
They really were.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, our main guide is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They have a really great entry on Adam de Wodeham, and it covers his whole life, his main works, all the important stuff he thought about, including this thing called the complex significant. It's a mouthful, I know. But the goal here, like always, is to break it all down. So it makes sense, even if you're not, a medieval scholar.
Right. No need for, a PhD in Latin to follow along here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
First things first, who was this Adam de Wodeham guy?
Well, he was born sometime around 1295 near Southampton, ended up joining the Franciscans, which back then was a major intellectual hub, a lot of deep thinking happening there. And his real philosophical journey, it kind of kicks off in London. That's where he studies under some pretty big names, Walter Chatton, and of course the one and only William of Ockham.
Ah, Ockham. Couldn't get away from him, could we? But yeah, I mean, that connection to Ockham, that's really important, right? It sets the stage for so much of what Wodeham would go on to think about, whether he agreed with Ockham or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And so after Ockham takes off for Avignon, Wodeham keeps on studying, this time at Oxford, with Richard Fitzralph. And eventually he gets to this really prestigious position, lecturing on the sentences of Peter Lombard. It was the thing to do if you were a serious scholar back then, the philosophical, theological proving ground.
Publish or perish, but for medieval times.
Right, exactly. And we know he gave these lectures in a few different places. London first,
Mm-hmm.
then Norwich, which is where his Lectura Secunda, his second reading, comes from. And finally, he ends up at Oxford, where he writes his, his magnum opus, the Ordinatio Oxoniensis, somewhere between 1332 and 1334. I mean, can you imagine being there at Oxford? The 61st lecture at the Greyfriars, just deep in thought, grappling with these huge questions.
It must have been quite the scene.
Yeah, intense intellectual vibes for sure.
And Wodeham, he wasn't just lecturing, he was writing too, a lot.
We have those two big commentaries on the sentences, of course. Plus, he wrote a prologue to Ockham's Symologicae, a shorter piece on the continuum. Well, it's a long title, the Tractatus de Indivisibilibus, the Tractatus Alphabeticus. And some scholars even think he might have had a hand in some of Ockham's other writings.
But yeah, like you said, it's those sentences, commentaries, especially the Ordinatio, where he really shines. That's where you see the full scope of his thinking on all the big topics. Right. But our source, the Stanford Encyclopedia, they point out that there are a couple of things that make it kind of tricky to really grasp how important Wodeham was. There's this whole historiographical problem. Basically, for a long time, people saw the late Middle Ages as this, intellectual wasteland.
Yeah, nothing interesting happened between, Aquinas and Descartes.
Totally. But luckily, scholarship's moving past that,
Oh, for sure. We're way more nuanced now about how we see history. And then, on top of that, there's the textual problem, which just means that for a long time, good, reliable editions of Wodeham's work, and even the works of the people he was talking to, they were hard to come by.
Trying to understand a conversation when you're missing half the dialogue.
Exactly. But thankfully, we have critical editions now, which makes a huge difference. And William Courtney, he's been a big name in all that, really bringing these texts back to light.
Right, Courtney's work is essential. And it helps us see Wodeham not just as this, lone genius, but as part of this whole community of thinkers. His socii, they called them. Other scholars at Oxford, Modicus Niger, Robert Holcott, William Craythorne, all these guys working on the sentences around the same time, bouncing ideas off each other.
A real intellectual exchange happening.
Totally. And Wodeham's influence, it wasn't just stuck at Oxford either. The source says that between 1334 and 1346, his ideas, they were making the rounds in England, Paris, even Cologne.
Spreading the Wodeham love.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while the English theologians, they weren't always the best at giving credit where credit was due.
A little sloppy with the footnotes.
Yeah, a little. But it's clear they were engaging with his lectures. But over in Paris, in the 1340s, Wodeham's impact, it's even clearer. You have these major thinkers, Gregory of Rimini, Alphonsus Vargas, John of Miricord, all directly referencing his work, especially the Oxford Ordinatio. And Rimini, wow, he really went deep on Wodeham.
Yeah, Rimini, he was a big fan.
Big time. And then you have Germany, too, right? Probably thanks to Wodeham going to Basel in 1339. Apparently, he brought a copy of the Ordinatio with him. There's even evidence of a theologian in Cologne lecturing, according to Adam, before 1348. I mean, that's pretty impressive spread for the time.
Definitely pre-internet viral.
Right. And even when some theological controversies popped up later in the 14th century, people are still citing Wodeham. Shows you how relevant his ideas were. And then in the 15th century, it's like, Wodeham mania. Tons of references.
Yeah.
And you even have this guy, Henry Totting of Oida, who creates an abbreviato, basically like Wodeham's greatest hits.
The Cliff's Notes for the Ordinatio.
Exactly. And that became a big text in itself. It's just really fascinating to see how interconnected the intellectual world was back then.
Yeah, these weren't just isolated thinkers, right? It was more like this web of ideas, everyone building on, arguing with, inspiring each other.
A true community of thought.
So with all that background, let's actually dive into some of Wodeham's ideas, shall we? Starting with his philosophy of mind, specifically how he thought about cognition, how we come to know things.
All right, into the mind we go. Now, this is something that modern scholars have really been interested in, partly because Wodeham himself dedicated a lot of time to it, and partly because we have this really detailed account in his Lectura Secunda. And a big part of this, something he got from both Scotus and Occam, is this distinction between intuitive and abstractive cognition, like how we grasp something that's right there in front of us versus how we think about things that are absent or, in a more general abstract way.
So intuitive is like here and now, and abstractive is more like thinking about stuff.
Exactly. And both Scotus and Occam, they said that both our senses, like how we perceive the world, and our intellect, how we think and reason, they both have their own versions of intuitive and abstractive cognition, like a parallel structure.
Okay, I'm following so far.
But Wodeham, he wasn't a fan of unnecessary complexity. He really liked this idea of ontological parsimony, which basically means don't multiply entities beyond what you absolutely need.
Like Occam's razor, but for, everything.
Exactly. So he looked at this whole parallel structure thing and thought, hang on, if our senses already give us this direct grasp of a present object, why do we need the intellect to do the same thing? Isn't that redundant?
So, if you see a tree, you see a tree. Why would your mind need to then have its own separate seeing of that same tree?
Right. And he argued that, if you say that the intellect needs its own special intuitive act, it leads us to some weird conclusions.
What kind of conclusions?
Well, you'd either end up with two souls in one person, which, following Augustine, that was a no-go, or you'd need a sensitive power, a separate thing that's not the intellectual soul but can still, grasp things. But then you're basically back to having multiple souls anyway.
So, to keep things simple, Wodeham just says, look, there's one soul, the intellectual soul, and it can do both, sensing and understanding.
Exactly. And that led him to this, pretty bold statement that the intellect senses, which is a pretty big departure from Occam. But Wodeham, he was willing to follow his parsimony principle wherever it led.
Even if it meant disagreeing with the big guy. But even though he disagreed with Occam about the soul, he actually agreed with Scotus's definition of intuitive knowledge.
Right. So Wodeham defines intuitive knowledge as this simple act. It's not complex. And it can cause us to really know for sure with evidence a truth about something that's right there in front of us, something contingent. But, and this is important, it requires that the object actually exists and is present. It's not enough that it exists somewhere. It has to be there, acting on our senses.
Okay, so it has to be real and it has to be here.
Right. And this is where the difference with Occam gets really interesting, because Occam famously said that you could have intuitive knowledge not just of things that are present, but also of things that are absent. You could know that something doesn't exist because you're having an intuition of its absence. Wodeham really pushed back against that.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right.
With the whole Socrates is dead thing.
Exactly. So he uses this example, right? You see Socrates' dead body, and based on that, you judge that Socrates is no longer alive. But Wodeham says, hang on, what you're actually intuiting, what you're directly grasping, is the dead body. That's the present object.
So your intuition is of something that is not something that isn't.
Precisely. The judgment that Socrates doesn't exist, that's an inference. It's something you figure out based on what you're sensing, but it's not the direct object of your intuition.
It's like your senses tell you dead body here, and then your mind goes, oh, that means Socrates is gone.
Right, exactly.
Huh?
So for Wodeham, that present object, that's the key. And then when we talk about abstractive knowledge, he again follows Scotus. He says that the difference between intuitive and abstractive knowledge isn't really about the object itself, but about how we're thinking about it.
Okay, so like if I'm looking at a tree, that's intuitive, but I'm thinking about the concept of treeness, that's abstractive.
Exactly. With abstractive knowledge, it doesn't matter if the object is actually there or not. And you can't make a judgment about whether something exists just based on abstractive knowledge. It's more about understanding the nature of something, its properties, regardless of whether it's actually there or not.
Okay, makes sense. So we have these two kinds of knowledge, and then things get even more interesting when you bring in this whole debate about those lingering sensory impressions, the esses apparens.
Ah, yeah, the after images. So this guy, Peter Orioli, he argued that we can have a sensory intuition of something even after it's gone, because those sensory images, they kind of stick around. And this, of course, led to some pretty big worries about, can we actually trust our senses?
Right, because if what you're immediately aware of is just a leftover image, how do you know it's a true reflection of what was actually there? What if reality is just a giant highlight reel of after images?
Yeah, that's a bit trippy. So if our senses leave these phantom appearances and our intellect also produces an S intentionale, like a mental representation, then the worry is that our intuitive knowledge might not be of the real object at all, but just of these representations.
Like we're stuck in a simulation of our own making.
Exactly. And that raises the scary possibility that what we think we see, what seems present, might not actually be real.
Okay, so how do we get out of this skeptical nightmare?
Well, Occam, he had a strategy. He said, look, the problem isn't with our initial intuitions. Those are usually reliable. The problem is with the inferences we make from them. So our basic sensory experiences, they're trustworthy, but we mess things up when we start jumping to conclusions that aren't actually supported by what we're seeing.
It's not the senses that lie, it's our interpretations that go astray.
Right. But Walter Chatton, he wasn't convinced. He said, hold on, these after images, they don't just look like leftover impressions, they look like the actual object itself.
Like, if you stare at a light bulb and then close your eyes, you still see that light bulb. It's not just a vague impression of brightness.
Exactly. So Chatton said that these after images are actually caused by a lingering version of the object's form, its species, even after the object itself is gone. And this meant that you could potentially have an intuition of something that wasn't actually there through this lingering species.
Okay, so where does Wodeham fit into all this?
He sides with Occam. He says that in cases of after images, what we perceive are just remnants of the form or species that were caused by the original perception.
So like echoes of the original sensation.
Yeah, kind of. But the mistake we make thinking that we're still seeing the original object, that's not because of those remnants themselves. It's because our imagination gets carried away and makes us think that what we're seeing in the after image is the same as what we saw when the object was actually there.
So for Wodeham, the problem isn't a faulty intuition. It's a faulty judgment.
Right. Our imagination tricks us. It makes us believe things that our senses don't actually warrant. And this brings us to the whole question of certitude. How can we actually be sure about anything if our imaginations are running wild?
Right. How do we build knowledge on a foundation of potentially deceptive after images? So to answer that, Wodeham outlines 3 degrees of evidence for a proposition.
3 levels of knowing, essentially.
Exactly. So the most basic level is just understanding the proposition itself, grasping what it means. He uses the example of a stick in water, how it looks bent. Our senses tell us broken stick. But that can be wrong.
Right.
Because water's tricky like that.
Yeah, appearances can be deceiving, especially in the realm of the contingent, the changeable world of physical things.
Right. But then you have the second degree of evidence, and this is for propositions that not only seem certain, but actually can't be false. They have to be true. And Wodeham says that these are always categorical propositions about the nature of things, and they're necessary, meaning they have to be that way.
So not just the sky is blue, but more 2 + 2 = 4, something that can't be otherwise.
Exactly. And then at the top of the pyramid, you have the third, the highest degree of evidence. And this belongs to propositions that not only can't be false, but also can't be doubted. They force you to agree. These are the propositions that are just true in themselves, per se nota, as he called them.
Self-evident truths.
Right. So with the second type of proposition, even though you know it has to be true, you might still doubt it if some other proposition also seems true and they contradict each other. But with the third type, that doubt is just gone. It's so obviously true that you can't help but believe it.
Okay, so we have these evident propositions, but what about evident judgments? Like, what does it mean to make a judgment that's truly evident?
Right. So for Wodeham, a judgment is like a mental action. It's saying, yes, this proposition matches reality. And obviously, the first two types of evidence, they don't give you that absolute certainty.
So to be absolutely sure, you need those per se nota propositions, the self-evident truths.
Right. But Wodeham also says that there's another way to get that highest level of certainty, even with propositions that weren't originally self-evident. And that's through a demonstrative syllogism.
The classic, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal kind of thing.
Exactly. So his idea is that when you believe the conclusion of a valid syllogism, what you're really assenting to isn't just the conclusion by itself. It's the whole argument, the conclusion plus the premises. So the conclusion on its own might not be per se nota, but it gets its certainty from being connected to those premises in that logical structure.
So it's the whole package deal that makes it undeniable, and this emphasis on the entire syllogism, that's something that Gregory of Rimini would later argue against.
Right, but for Wodeham, it was all about that whole structure. And this leads us to one of his, I think, most important and definitely most discussed ideas, the complex significable.
Oh yes, the complex significable, a real brain teaser.
It is. So he came up with this idea to try and find a middle ground in this debate about what knowledge is actually about.
Right, because you had Occam on one side, who Wodeham understood as saying that knowledge is about the individual terms in a proposition, like the words themselves.
Okay, so focusing on the pieces.
Yeah, and that's sometimes seen as like an anti-realist position because it's not really about the things in the world, but more about how we talk about them. And then on the other side, you have Walter Chatton, who said that the object of knowledge is the actual thing in the world that the subject term of a proposition refers to.
So, like, if you say the tree is tall, Chatton would say that knowledge is about the actual tree itself.
Exactly. But Wodeham, he wasn't satisfied with either of those. He thought they were both missing something. So he said that the real object of knowledge is this complex significability, which is like a whole state of affairs, something that you can only really capture with a complete proposition.
So not just the words, not just the things, but the whole situation they describe.
Right, and this complex significability, it's not just some abstract idea, it has real ontological weight, like it's a thing in itself. But, and here's the tricky part, it doesn't really fit into the categories that Aristotle gave us for, like, what exists. It's not a substance, and it's not an accident, like a quality of a substance.
So what is it then?
That's the big philosophical question. It seems like what he's getting at is that the complex significability is what makes a proposition true. Like it's the truth maker. It's the actual condition in reality that corresponds to what the proposition says. And the history of this concept is interesting too. For a long time, people thought Gregory of Rimini came up with it, but now we know it was Wodeham all along. Although earlier thinkers had explored similar ideas, talking about dicta and enunciabilia, things that can be said or enunciated.
So like proto-complex significability.
Yeah, kind of. But Wodeham's version, it really took things to another level. He went beyond just thinking about terms or things and said that knowledge is about these whole states of affairs. And that had a huge impact on how people thought about truth and meaning.
Makes sense. And speaking of Rimini, he did pick up on Wodeham's idea and kind of ran with it.
Yeah, he definitely took it and made it his own, although some scholars say that Rimini's version might have been a bit, like, simplified, maybe even a little distorted compared to Wodeham's more subtle take. Like maybe he made it a bit too real, too much of a thing, which made it easier to criticize.
Like he took a delicate idea and turned it into a blunt instrument.
Maybe. But there are also scholars like Brouwer Toland who say, no, Wodeham's complex significaba was always this radical idea. Like it really challenged the way people thought about what exists.
So no matter how you interpret it, it's clear that Wodeham was on to something. And it's still sparking debate today.
Yeah, which I think is pretty cool. It shows that these medieval debates, they still matter for how we understand language, truth, and, what's real.
Big questions. Speaking of big questions, let's move on to Wodeham's philosophical theology. Like his attempts to prove that God exists.
Right, into the divine realm. So the source tells us that he offers two different proofs for God's existence, and he does this in both his Lectura Secunda and his Ordinatio. And he's very clear that the first proof, that one comes from Scotus, and he says it's super convincing. The second one, that one seems to be all Wodeham.
Okay, so proof number one, the Scotus special.
Right. So it starts with a simple question. Is there a first cause, something that caused everything else but wasn't itself caused by anything? Or is there not? Now, if there is, well, that's God, right? But if there isn't, then you end up with this infinite chain of causes going back forever. And both Wodeham and Scotus, they said that an infinite series of what they called essentially ordered causes, that's impossible.
Okay, back up a second. Essentially ordered causes.
Right, sorry. So essentially ordered causes are those where like the later cause totally depends on the earlier one for its very existence. It's different from accidentally ordered causes where things just happen one after the other in time, but they don't like depend on each other for their being.
So essentially ordered is like parent and child.
Yeah.
Accidentally ordered is like dominoes falling.
Perfect. So Wodeham and Scotus, they said that you can't have an infinite chain of these essentially ordered causes, because then the whole chain itself would need a cause, which doesn't make sense. And it would also mean that you need an infinite number of causes acting at the same time to make anything happen, which is also just incoherent.
So basically they're saying that there has to be a beginning to the chain, a first cause, and that first cause is God.
Right. And then Wodeham offers his own proof, and this one, he gets some inspiration from Anselm's proslogion, that famous ontological argument.
Okay, so Wodeham is taking on Anselm. Bold move.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to engage with the greats. So his argument also starts with a question. Does there exist a most noble being, something so perfect that you can't even imagine anything better? Or does such a being not exist? And Wodeham says that if there's no such being, then you'd have this endless ladder of increasingly noble things with no top rung. And that's just not satisfying to the intellect.
Like an infinite staircase that goes nowhere.
Exactly. So he says there has to be a most noble thing that actually exists. And he agrees with Anselm that whatever exists in reality is more perfect than something that just exists as a possibility.
Okay, so existence beats potentiality in the perfection game.
Right. But here's the thing. Wodeham himself admits that this proof, it only gets you to that second level of evidence, which means it's not totally beyond doubt.
So not quite as airtight as the Scotus proof.
Right, but still a pretty interesting argument. And the key takeaway here is how he adapted that ontological argument, focusing on this idea that existing is better than just potentially existing.
Makes sense. And then after all that, he moves on to the question of God's unicity. Like, is there only one God or could there be multiple?
Right. Monotheism versus polytheism.
Exactly. But he approaches this not by saying, here's why there can't be multiple gods, but more like, let's look at the arguments people have made for and against the idea of one God.
Like he's playing devil's advocate.
Kinda, yeah. And he looks at all sorts of arguments, including ones from Scotus and counter-arguments from Occam. And in the end, he says that using reason alone, you can't definitively prove that there's only one God, even though he himself probably believed that there's only one.
So he's open to the possibility that reason might not have all the answers here.
Right, and even when he looks at specific arguments for God's unity, he's still cautious. Like with one of Scotus's arguments, he says it's probably persuasive, but leaves room for doubt. Which really shows you how rigorous he was, like even with something as fundamental as this.
Yeah, he's not just taking things on faith. He's really examining the arguments carefully. And then we get to this other fascinating but often overlooked part of his work, his Trinitarian theology.
Right, the Trinity. One God, three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Yeah, that whole thing. And he talks about this in both his Lectura and his Ordinatio. And it seems like he was really caught up in this challenge of trying to make sense of the Trinity using Aristotelian logic, which was like the logic at the time.
Yeah, like everyone was using Aristotle.
Right. But the problem is, when you try to apply Aristotelian logic to the Trinity, you end up with these weird situations. Like you can construct syllogisms, those logical arguments that look totally valid, and they have true premises, but then they lead to conclusions that are obviously false and like heretical from a Christian perspective.
So like bad theology dressed up in good logic.
Exactly. And the classic example is, this divine essence is the Father. This divine essence is the Son. Therefore, the Son is the Father. Like, logically, it seems fine, but theologically, it's nonsense.
Right, it just doesn't work. So what did theologians do about this?
Well, there were a couple of approaches. Some people said, look, Aristotle's logic, it's great for the natural world, but maybe it just doesn't apply to God. Like, maybe divine logic is just different.
Okay, so different rules for different realms.
Right, but most people, including Occam and Wodeham, they said, no, logic is universal. It applies everywhere. The problem is with the syllogisms, not with logic itself.
So like finding the flaw in the code.
Exactly. And Wodeham, he gets really into this in his Ordinatio. He's not questioning Aristotle. He's saying, let's look closely at these syllogisms and see where they go wrong.
Okay, so like a logic detective.
Exactly. And he uses this example. Every divine essence is the Father. Every divine essence is the Son. Therefore, the Son is the Father. And he says, look, the problem here is that the term divine essence, when it's the subject of the premises, it's referring to more than just the Father. It's also referring to the Son and the Holy Spirit.
So it's like using a word that means one thing in one part of the argument and then a different thing in another part.
Right, but the term Father, it doesn't refer to the Son, so you're violating the rules of a valid syllogism. And this is a specific kind of fallacy called the fallacy of the figure of speech. Wodeham's whole approach here, it's super analytic. Like, he's dissecting these paradoxes, finding the logical errors, and showing that you can actually have both logic and the Trinity without contradiction.
It's like saving the Trinity with logic.
Exactly. And then moving on, we have Wodeham's contributions to natural philosophy.
Right, so not just God in the mind, but the world itself.
Exactly. And he's presented as a key figure in this group of thinkers called the Theologia Anglicana. They're really into questions of natural philosophy. And you can see this influence, especially when he talks about the nature of the continuum and the latitude of forms.
Okay, break that down for me. What's a continuum and what's all this about the latitude of forms?
All right, so the continuum, it's basically about the structure of things that are continuous, like space and time. Like, is a line infinitely divisible, or is it made up of tiny indivisible parts? And Wodeham, like a lot of English thinkers at the time, he was involved in this big debate between divisibleism and indivisibilism, or atomism.
Okay, so divisibleism is like you can always divide something in half no matter how small it gets.
Yeah.
And atomism is like there's a limit, there are these fundamental indivisible particles.
Exactly. And following Occam, Wodeham was firmly on the divisibilist side. He argued against the idea that things are ultimately made up of these, like, atomic building blocks. And his work on this, the Tractatus de Indivisibilibus, it's really valuable because it shows us how complex this debate was, how both sides were making sophisticated arguments.
And this wasn't just some abstract philosophical game, right?
No, not at all. It was about the very nature of reality, like what is space, what is time. And while Aristotle himself argued against atomism, there were some thinkers in the late 13th century, like Robert Grosseteste, Richard of Hartley, and Walter Chatton, who started to revive the idea.
So bringing back the atom.
Yeah, in a way. And then in the 14th century, the debate really heated up. It was all about, like, are space and time infinitely divisible, as the Aristotelians, like Wodeham and Thomas Bradwardine, said? Or are they ultimately made up of these discrete, indivisible units?
So smooth and continuous versus blocky and discrete.
Right. And the indivisibilists, they argued that these temporal and spatial they were made up of these indivisibles. Things like, instants of time and indivisible lines.
Like the smallest possible bits of time and space.
Yeah, they thought of them as extended but not divisible, not quite like the atoms we talk about today, but similar in that they were seen as these fundamental units. And thinkers like Hartley and Chatton, they had some pretty clever arguments for how you could build a continuous reality out of these indivisibles.
Okay, so Wodeham's against all that.
Yeah, he's on team divisibility. And his Tractatus de Indivisibilibus, it's a big work. He has 5 main questions he tackles, and he lays out all these arguments against indivisiblism. He goes after Hartley and Chatton directly, and he even takes on Zeno's paradoxes.